Okay. So my name's Jennifer Cohen Harper. We have a fairly short amount of time to be with you today. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to the people who are here on the stage with me, and then we're going to dive in. So this is a group of some of the most thoughtful, hardworking, passionate people that I know. And that's not even a little bit of an exaggeration. If anything, it may be underplaying it, right? These are good people here. We've got Adi Flesher, who is part of the Care for Teachers program and has a deep well of experience working in education and contemplative education in particular. Leslie Booker, who is the director of teacher training for the Lineage Project. If you guys aren't familiar with the Lineage Project, it's a program that shares yoga and mindfulness with incarcerated and system-involved young people. She's also the founder of the Urban Sangha Project. Joanne Spence is the director of yoga in schools. Some of you may have been with her already this weekend in other capacities. She also has a real passion for bringing yoga to mental health care settings. And Traci Childress is the co-founder of the Children's Community School in Philadelphia, which is a school that is really dedicated to bringing mindfulness practices into the culture of the school. And she works with teachers in particular to help support ethical, just practices for working with children. She was also my co-founder on the Best Practices for Yoga in Schools guide. That's back over there with Charlene. So that's who we've got with us. And why don't we take just a moment, so you know who everybody is. Just take a moment to check in, right? We've been here collectively for the weekend now. We've been here together, meeting a lot of people, learning a lot of things. There's been a lot happening. Maybe before we launch into all these kind of big questions, just take a moment, like about 10 seconds, to check in with how you're doing right now, right? Maybe just one word check in. Where are you at? How are you doing? One word, what's coming up for you? And share that word with a neighbor. One word. So this should only take a second. Just share that word with a neighbor and then come right back. Thank you. So would you guys... See how that happens, just like with your kids, right? All right, so I'm going to ask these guys to share their word, and then we'll share some other things as well. Will you share your word?
I'm sort of embarrassed. Hungry. Excited.
A little confused.
Curious.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. All right, so best practices for sustainability and growth with integrity. We'll just tackle this small topic. Okay, so you guys are all here together, which is amazing, which is evidence of the fact that children's yoga is growing, right? This field is growing, and we are reaching more and more kids, more and more adults as well. And one of the things that we were really motivated to come and talk with you all about and dig into a little bit is what happens when a small field starts growing. Right? What happens when a small field starts growing? And what happens is we get more attention. And that comes with pluses and minuses, and it asks something different of us than just like going out there and doing great and having fun with our kids. Right? As the field of yoga has been growing in general, yoga for children has been growing, yoga in schools has been growing, and with that growth, we're reaching more kids. And we also need to ask ourselves different questions as kind of the spotlight shines on the work that we're all doing. We have to ask ourselves, how are we holding ourselves accountable? How are we holding ourselves to the highest standards? What are we doing to keep things within our community strong? And one of the great things about a conference like this is it gives us the opportunity to come together and work in collaboration. Gives us the opportunity to come and be together as a field, right? So one of the things that we've been talking about is the yoga community in general is this field that is often sort of viscerally and reflexively kind of opposed in a lot of ways to regulation, right? To regulation, to oversight. We're shying away from, for lots of good reasons, having external systems of accountability. Yet at the same time, we're saying, we're doing good work. Take us seriously. Right? We want to impact the world in a big way. So one of the questions that's coming up for us, and the first question that I would put to the panelists is, how do we navigate this space where, many of the fields that impact kind of the public health and well-being, like healthcare, or mental health, education, social work, have pretty high barriers to entry, very rigorous kind of certification processes, and strong systems of internal kind of accountability and regulation. Not saying that's always so great, right? But that is kind of what happens in most of these fields that impact the public health. If, as a community, we're saying, no, right? Then what does that mean for us in terms of how we work in collaboration and hold ourselves accountable internally as a community, to making sure what we're offering is safe, is effective, is sustainable, and ethical? Yeah. Maybe Traci, you could start.
Okay, that's not a small question.
Sorry.
I just want to invite you, before I share what my response to that is, to just take maybe 30 seconds and like sit. That was a very large and poignant an important question for all of us. So just taking the next 20 seconds to 2025 to think and reflect for yourself. So just doing that first.
Sorry. Yes. Okay, thank you. Sorry. I forgot my intention. To ask you to sit. So my question is, if as a community we feel, and it's been evidence in the community, that external systems of kind of oversight and accountability are not what we're looking for, are there ways that we can work collaboratively with each other, right? How can we hold each other and ourselves accountable as a community to high standards that support safe, ethical teaching? And you don't need an answer, but maybe if you could take about 20 seconds to think about how that question feels, right? What's coming up for you as you hear that question asked, that might be worth sitting with for a moment.
Okay, so I think that accountability really is about creating safe spaces that are accessible to all people. So accountability and knowing ourselves. So accountability really starts with relationship. So what is my relationship as a person to what I'm offering? What is my relationship to the folks I'm offering it with? And what is my relationship to all the other people doing this work, right? It's like, when we step into a school classroom, we're stepping into a very nuanced place where a lot of intersecting realities are there with us, right? So accountability says, know where you are and find out all there is to know and all there is that you may not even know you need to know in this space. So when I walk into a space, I might know what I know and I might be able to identify some things I don't know about it, but I need someone else to help me see my blind spots, because I might not even know that I don't know something that's really important to know to create a safe space for my students. Does that make sense? So to me, that's like at the heart of accountability. And so at a very simple level, I mean, Jen asked it at a very big level about regulation, but my experience of us as a community is that we're still trying to find common language. We're still trying to be able to, and that's where we have to start, like with conversations about what are we doing, why are we doing it, what is working, what is not, what are we noticing, and what are we not noticing. And one of the things that I see in the yoga world, and in yoga and education is it's a very proprietary world. It's like we write our books, we have our programs, we have our curricula, and to make a livelihood doing this thing that we love, we have to protect that. And I think we got to step into that place of discomfort and get over that to some degree. I mean, still protect our work. I don't mean work for free and don't have a livelihood, but really talk, like, not let that hold us back from building a community, because until we can really have these conversations, we can't hold each other accountable. You know, what is a safe space? What makes a space safe? And one last thing about that I think is important to look at when moving towards accountability, and I think all this has to start with us before we could even talk about creating like a larger body. So I think is looking at our intention and our impact and creating really concrete systems and timelines for doing that. So it's not enough to love yoga and want to share it with kids. It's not. That's important. We surely don't want people who hate yoga sharing yoga with kids. That would be really bad. So that's a really important like spark. But that doesn't mean that the impact of my teaching is gonna be transformative for everyone that I try to share it with. Yeah? So I have to build systems for asking and seeking information about what the impact of what I'm doing is, and integrate that into a reflection process and a revision process. So we need each other to do that. Like, I can't do it alone. I have to get feedback, constructive feedback, to refine things to meet the real needs of folks. So those are my thoughts. Yeah.
Did any of you guys want to add anything?
I would just expand on that very specifically of understanding the system you're in, whether it's a school or a community space or a studio space or a hospital. Each have some similar but sometimes very different rules and regulations to work within. So having this reflective process and internal process is really important. And additionally, you have to understand what context that you're coming into that has its own special set of rules and regulations that are really important that you understand to whom you're talking to.
You good? Yeah, all right, thank you. Thank you. So as we start talking about this topic, it kind of blends into the reality that often one of the greatest challenges for children's yoga is the perception, and maybe sometimes even the reality, that children's yoga is being taught sometimes in ways that are not secular. And the perception of yoga as a religion is something that we all have to deal with in the work that we're doing. So I would ask, in what ways this kind of intersection between secularism, yoga, the reality, and the misperception of what the yoga is, how is that kind of coming up in your own work, and what do you see as the way forward as this question comes up? Do you want to, maybe Adi, do you want to start? Oh, I'm sorry, Joanne. Yeah, Joanne, do you want to start?
Yeah, and I'd like to frame that in the last 10 years we've been bringing, as my role as executive director of yoga in schools, this is a topic that comes up, but I have to say on a personal level that there hasn't been as much as what you might think of people saying, oh, this is a religious practice. It's not that hasn't happened, but it's been less common than one would expect. But I think we can really learn from what has been going on in the world at large. And one of those things is a court case that happened a few years ago that's still in the news today. And that was a group of parents that sued the Encinitas School District, and you might have heard of that. And I think that there are some really important things that came, that we all learned as a community from that time that we're still learning about and hearing from. And I think that even that as I was reviewing and listening as that case came into being, and if you haven't heard about that case, it's a really important case to review and look at the transcripts, or just to even get the summary of that. And even those of us that may use yoga as a spiritual practice personally, I think that the academics and the people that were weighing in and were brought in as expert witness were agreeing that you did not have to have a religion to practice yoga. And this is something that is really important to understand if you want to have access to public schools. So I think there is many people in this room that have written about this, that have really good policies around this. But I think it's something that we have to internalize and understand both as a personal and a public way of seeing this as access for everybody if you want to teach in public spaces. So I think that's just something that we need to understand. And I know you had something to add to that too.
Just a very short something is that we don't all mean the same thing when we say secular. It's one of the terms we don't have a collective understanding of. And so I would encourage us, and I challenge myself to push into that and not assume that our own definitions are accurate, to get feedback, to ask people in academic positions that can help you in education, educators, to look at curriculum and look at programs and help you identify where you might be accidentally sneaking non-secular practices into a school where that's not ethical or legal. Yeah. Okay, Jen, do you have an example, or does someone besides me have an example?
Well, did somebody want to? Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great example. And it's a great example in part because, when we talk about this, maybe what's coming up in your head is Om and Namaste and chanting in Sanskrit. And would we all be thinking like, oh, should I teach a sun salutation? And, what comes up for me as you say that and, to kind of answer this question is, I think that when we're talking about this kind of what is religious, what is secular, I think it's important that we remember that we have a commitment to transparency, right? To full transparency and to sort of openness to saying, what is it that's going to serve this community? What is it that's essential to the kids' experience? And are there things that may be sort of skirting the line that we could argue, like reasonably argue, aren't religious or are religious, but that maybe aren't essential to the kids' experience? And then we have to make judgment calls about, if this isn't essential to the child's experience, and it may be kind of a red flag or raising concerns of the community, I better have a damn good reason for doing it if I'm doing it, right? Like that's always the question for me, is like, it's not, can I argue that this isn't religious? It's that, is it something that may be perceived as religious by this community? And can that be resolved through transparency, right, through conversations? And maybe it could have in that situation, I don't know, right? Maybe if there was kind of a sense of, okay, this is what we're doing, this is why, maybe not. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Abundance of caution, right? Abundance of caution and respect for the community that you're working with. Just always asking the question, what is essential to the kids' experience? How might this be perceived? And if you don't know, ask, right? Ask. Yeah. Yeah, did you want to? Yeah. Absolutely. Could everybody hear that? Can you guys hear each other? So what Callie is sharing is such a true and important thing, and then we'll shift questions, is that what every single one of us does affects everybody in this room and beyond, right? That as we're coming together as a community and as the field is growing, it also means that what every single one of us does impacts whether kids are going to have access to yoga in public spaces, maybe forever, right? These conversations that we're having now may impact the future of this field for a long time. So I think that what Kelly's bringing up is so important. Like, every single one of us has to be accountable, right? This question of accountability, we don't have regulation and external accountability. We're largely an unregulated field. So we have to personally hold ourselves accountable to each other, right? My choices in my classes impact every single one of you. Yeah? Yeah, maybe last. What's your name? Kristen. So I just want to repeat, since I don't think you can all hear each other. So what Kristen is saying is she works in the pharmaceutical industry, and then she had to say, some energetically say, don't hate me, right? Because what she's saying is that, the majority of the field is ethical, and they are highly regulated. And then there are a handful of people who have done things that they really shouldn't do, and the whole world hates the pharmaceutical industry. So this really gets right to the heart of like holding ourselves personally accountable, holding each other accountable, and seeing, you asked for an example because sometimes it's hard to see clearly, especially when we're so passionate about what we're doing. So we need each other. We need each other. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity,
You want to turn it on? There's a button. Yeah.
Forgot that piece. Just out of curiosity, and how many people, just show of hands, have dealt with the issue of the practice being accused of not being secular, of being religious? Meaning that you had a parent or a child that it came up in the work you were doing in schools or in public settings. Okay, so it's a very live issue. I just wanted to share, 'cause I think I'm both very optimistic and also in some ways pessimistic about it. I think we will be seeing this in courts again many times soon. But I wanted to share a kind of slightly different perspective, which is right before talking up here, Joanne and I touched base and realized we're both from Pittsburgh, and we both know a lot of common people. The other thing we realized is that I'm working on curriculum for integrating mindfulness into Jewish schools, and that she's interested in working on a curriculum for doing that in Christian settings, and that she's actually already working with a Jewish organization that's doing it. So at the same time as we're dealing with this kind of question of what belongs in our collective public spaces around practices that promote well-being of mind and body, we're actually also dealing with it in the reverse. It's how can we promote well-being of mind and body in our spiritual traditions? And I think that actually can give us some sustenance and some ways of thinking about it. So I have one other quick question, which is how many people have a sort of 2-sentence kind of rehearsed elevator speech about how they think about secularity and yoga? So keep those hands up for a second, and right as we're done, find the people who have their hands up and have that conversation with them. And actually, I should raise my hand because that's helpful. And I don't think there's a single one, but hearing a lot of them is really helpful.
1 minute.
Yeah, well, I talk a lot about how, we are all suffering. And so this practice helps to alleviate suffering. Don't we all want to feel better? Don't we all want to let go? And I come from a very, it's funny, like Jewish, Buddhist, Christian. I come from a very, very strong Buddhist background. Like that is the foundation of my life and my ethics and my values and my practice. But I have to separate my personal practice. I have to translate it. I'm teaching the Eightfold Path, but I would never call it that because it's simply ethics and ways to alleviate suffering. So if we let go of like the package that it comes in it and just go with like the feeling and the actual energy and the ethics and the practice behind it, that's how we make things hopefully more secular.
We need to wrap up this conversation a little bit for time's sake. But one of the things that I've heard these people here speak about in various ways that might be helpful in framing this, well, two things. One is, when you talk about, is the program secular? Do you do this? Do you do that? I find it very helpful to share, this is what we do, right? To actually say, for me, I'm the director, the founder of Little Flower Yoga, and our kind of spiel is we do practices that help kids connect to themselves and each other and the world around them. We do breath work to help them regulate their nervous system, be able to kind of calm themselves down and recognize how they're feeling in any situation. We do movement practices, we practice focusing, and then we relax. So it's like, know what you do, right? Like it's very hard to get into this like in a deep way, but it's like, this is a reasonable concern. There's lots of different types of yoga out there. There's lots of different ways to experience this practice. Let me share with you what we do. We connect, we breathe, we move, we focus, and we relax. Do you have any questions? Right? And for me, that framing of like, I can understand why that might be a concern for you. There's a lot out there. Here's what we offer. What are your questions and concerns? Like that framing. I get it. This is what we do. What are your questions? Serves me every single time. So maybe that, I don't know what exactly you do, but maybe that framing could help you. And then the last thing, that we've all kind of talked about is this idea of secularism as something that isn't about kind of getting in the door, right? Obviously, we need to work in public schools. Secularism is a legal requirement. But expand, not all of you are working in schools, right? Let's expand that to the children's yoga world in general. Why might secularism be important? Not so that we're not breaking the law, right? But because secularism is essentially about inclusivity. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but the goal of having secular practices in general, not in yoga land, right? But in the world in general, secularism is about creating a space where everybody, regardless of their religious background, is welcome, is invited, and is safe to participate, right? Secularism isn't about saying no religion, religion's bad, right? It's about not lifting any religion up over any other. It's not about quashing them, right? So I think that, for me, is helpful to remember, right? That holding ourselves to these principles of secularism is about creating a welcome, inclusive environment for everyone, not about checking off the box like, this is secular, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that, I'm good. Now I can just feel good about doing what I'm doing. It's a constant reflection on, who am I serving? Is the space safe for everybody to come participate? Yeah, okay. So speaking of spaces where everyone feels safe, one of the things that comes up quite a lot in schools and with Booker working in detention centers is this idea of what we're bringing in the yoga practice to children is often maybe feels like a mismatch for the spaces that we're entering. And I would ask the question of, given the climate and the culture of public education right now, with the emphasis on testing and some of the kind of, what always comes up for me is some of the very sort of control-oriented models of behavior management. Given the climate of public education and the culture in many schools today, how do you see yoga as playing a part in that space? What is this intersection between the yoga and the offerings that we have to share and the culture in some of these public institutions? Yeah, maybe Adi, you could start.
It's already on. So I'm curious again to just, first of all, it's just so lovely being in a room and being supported in figuring these questions out. So I want to kind of pick your guys' brains. How many of you are in public schools right now? Great. And how many of you are in public schools where you feel that the school culture is really vibrant and supports student well-being? Great. Yeah, I think it's a really important question, because we can get really strong narratives depending on where we're standing in the system. How many of you are in public schools that you feel do not support student or teacher well-being? Good. So, well, good in the sense that, for me, I work with teachers in the Department of Education in New York. Shout out to Kelly Love. In the Bronx, and actually I'd say that much more of them feel like they're in schools that don't support either student or teacher well-being. So I think that there's a challenge about kind of knowing what kind of school culture you're walking into. Right now in public education, 50% of teachers leave the classroom within 5 years. And for the vast majority of them, that's about stress. And that stress, I think, is a cycle that goes between the kids and the students in those schools that are not supporting student or teacher well-being. So my curiosity is when you come into a school and you're offering these practices, is there a way to offer the practices both as a way of addressing stress for kids and students, but also as a way of not accepting certain types of stress as okay and existing in systems? And I'm curious if for those of you, just sort of show of hands from people who are working in schools where the school culture is difficult or challenging, if you've begun to have conversations or the work that you're doing has triggered conversations about changes in the school culture. Yeah. I don't know that I can say anything super intelligent about that, other than to say that to me that's an area that is really alive and interesting. And I think that we see in a lot of places mindfulness or yoga being used in ways that I think you could almost see them as being Band-Aids over forms of toxic stress that we shouldn't accept. And yet, of course, I think, and maybe I'll hand it over to Booker, who can talk about her work, but I think these practices open up a space for internal transformation, and that space of internal transformation is profoundly related to the space of systems transformation. But I don't think either the mindfulness or the yoga community until the last year or two have really done a good job of speaking about that, creating language for that, and beginning to work with people who do systems change. So I think that'll be a really interesting place for all of us to explore together.
Thank you. I just got the warning from Michelle. So I'm just going to ask Booker to maybe speak to our last question, and then we'll wrap up, and I hope you guys can kind of carry this question out of the room with you, which is, as we are reaching more kids, as the Yoga for Children field isn't just about the parents who bring their kids to yoga, but as we're entering these public spaces, what may we need to reflect on or consider in terms of our commitment to serving every child, to creating truly inclusive, welcoming communities that honor diversity of every form, right? What do we need to consider?
So first of all, when we say diversity, that's a word that there's a lot of words we're kind of throwing around a lot without really defining lately. So when we say diversity, I think people kind of go to that binary of black or white. And I want to kind of just eradicate that from your minds if I could, just zoom, and get that out of your mind. It's so much deeper than that, and it's really about the culture in which we are going into. I work in alternative and second chance high schools, but also when I've worked in regular public schools in New York City, they look like jails. You go in and there are safety agents who are New York City police. They're not police officers, but they're hired by a New York City police force. There are metal detectors that kids go through. If a kid gets in trouble, they don't go to the principal's office. The cops are called and they get arrested. And so when we are going into community centers and schools and marginalized communities, we really need to understand the culture in which we are moving into. The culture in which we're moving into. So many of my kids have experienced extreme trauma in their lives, and also they don't view it as trauma. This is just the normality of their lives. So we really need to start to educate ourselves on social justice issues of what's going on in the world, because those are directly affecting our kids. In New York City, we incarcerate children as young as 7 years old. At 13, depending on your crime, you can be charged as an adult. And at 16, no matter what your crime is, you are charged as an adult. And so really understanding the fears in which our kids are growing up in, the historical trauma, the trauma of racism, the systemic oppression, all of these things are feeding into who these little beings are. And so often we think yoga will fix everything, mindfulness will fix everything. If we can just, then it'll fix everything. But actually, these practices are not always a panacea for everyone. It can be quite iatrogenic, meaning that the thing that we think is a cure is actually the thing that's causing more illness and more harm in our lives. And so as we move into expanding the practice and working with many different communities, it's really important to make sure that we can translate the practice into a practice that is relevant for them, that speaks to exactly who they are and where they're coming from. And not to go in as the expert, because we're not the expert as we move into these communities, but ask the community, ask the kids, what's going on? What do you need? How does this feel? How is this breathing? How is this movement? And then begin to develop a different way that yoga looks, a different way that meditation practice looks. I teach totally different now based on just listening and watching my kids. Because if I'm demanding they do something that way, but it's not organic for their body or their culture, it's going to make it more and more alienated and more disconnected from them. We want them to really have success in these practices. So we have to meet them where they are and transform our practice to meet them and to allow them to feel successful in the practice.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. If these questions and these thoughts are interesting to you, I would just point you towards maybe some resources and things to consider. The field of children's yoga can really learn a lot from related fields like mindfulness and education, social emotional learning, but also from kind of other yoga communities, the adaptive yoga community. I would point you all towards the work of the Yoga and Body Image Coalition. They have a wonderful book, I think it's called Yoga and Body Image, which is 20 some odd stories of people maybe with non-traditional yoga bodies or also yoga practices that might be a good resource. And then also, of course, the Best Practices for Yoga in Schools publication talks about a lot of these issues. Yeah, oh gosh, yes, and there's a whole world of trauma-sensitive yoga and trauma-informed yoga, which if you really look at the rates of trauma among our kids, it's totally overwhelming. You are working with kids who've experienced trauma, whether you know it or not. We have to go. Have a wonderful trip home, everyone. Thank you.